Hello everyone, welcome back to the Cine Bijou podcast. As you can see, the lights are dimming, the curtain is pulled back, and we're thrilled to pick up season 2 where we left off. From here on out, we'll be seeing you at least once a month with fresh episodes exploring the world of independent film. To keep up to date with latest episodes, you can find us on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. If you love what we're doing, the best way to help us grow is to subscribe, like, and share the show with your fellow cinephiles. We also want to hear from you, so please leave a comment on our latest episode and join the conversation. Finally, if you'd like to help keep the projector running, consider supporting us over on Patreon for exclusive rewards. Now, let's get into this month's feature.
Well, and adieu to you fair Spanish lady. Farewell and adieu, you ladies of Spain.
Jaws Explored is the most in-depth, wide-ranging, penetrating exploration of Spielberg's genius there has ever been. It's going to deepen your relationship with the most important film in your life.
We've spoken at least twice now on this podcast, and we met in person as well during the initial screening of Thing Expanded. And I think we've touched on this before, so I want to kind of get your thoughts on this. Having written and directed Aliens Expanded, and then of course The Thing Expanded, how has your approach to this format of storytelling, do you feel it's evolved?
It's a good question. I think, on a basic level, you obviously learn with everything you do. That's true of writing, that's true of my journalism back in the day. And I always kind of work to, whether it succeeds or not, the next thing is the best thing. The next thing will be the one that gets rid of all the things that have infuriated me with the last one and move on. I don't think that's always true, but that's what your mind and imagination and creative impulse does. So naturally, there's a sort of learning curve that goes on. I think it's important to make distinct the fact that Jaws Explored and The Expanded are different things. They're very related to one another, and obviously being directed by me, there will be a signature, stylistic, structural, that carries on. But the idea with The Explored is to be much more in terms of examining the film as it is, working out why it's great, how it ticks, what makes it, rather than perhaps the kind of memorial kind of making of elements that are part of the expanded thing. They're not all expanded, but when you have the kind of original casts, you do get a lot of waxing lyrical of back in the day, this happened, and back in the day. And that leads you to an idea of why those films worked. We're sort of turning that inside out with Explored, in that we're not going to the back in the day part of the equation, but we're still trying to figure out why it worked. And that's much more about people watching the film than people making the film. So that's a distinction to make. And also that means I've now got to learn almost to run again. I've got to learn a new format and not get caught up with maybe some habits I've obtained from the last two films. I've got to try and shake them off. And Jaws, while very related, I think, to The Thing and to Aliens, it's kind of tonally a slightly different film and slightly different category, very related, and that makes it interesting. So absolutely, I have to learn, and the kind of the material forces you to learn. You can't ever be complacent because these films are too good to be complacent about. So yeah, I'm on my toes for sure.
Yeah, it sounds it. So my first experience with Jaws then was, I think I was 5 years old, living in Iran.
Right.
And I don't know if you know much about Iranian cinema or Iranian film rules, but they have no rating system. They didn't then,
Right.
they don't now. So my father could take me and my friend to see Jaws on the big screen, and he did.
Right.
So that was my first experience, and I had nightmares and loved it ever since. What was your first experience seeing Jaws?
It's a shame I haven't quite got a great Jaws story. I had a good alien story and a good Thing story. I know I saw Jaws 2 first. Yeah, this is the era of VHSs, and my friend's dad is one of the early adopters of this kind of sort of rabbit hut shaped contraption, below the telly, which turned out to be a video recorder. And shops had opened in the local area, and we used to sneak up and see what he'd rented because he used to rent horror movies and things. And we were probably about 12 or 13, and he'd rented Jaws 2, and we watched that. And obviously, I understood by the fact it was number 2 that there'd been an original one. There was a Jaws 1 somewhere, but I hadn't got much of an idea that Jaws 1 had this great legend attached to it. I think, and this is kind of maybe me sort of retroactively kind of working things out, but I have a vague memory of television adverts for Jaws, the whole "you'll never go back in the ocean again," people running off beaches, that kind of thing. So I had a vague inkling of that, which might have sort of then influenced my expectations of Jaws 2. But having watched Jaws 2, we immediately wanted to see Jaws 1, And I can't remember precisely when it was. It was on VHS. It was rented. I think it was probably at a point in time when my mum relented and just let me get horror films, which is probably about 14. You go to the video shop and there'd be all the sections of a video shop. She'd be like, "How about these over here?" It'd be sort of adventure films. And I'd be straight to the horror section because at 14, that's all you want to see. And I don't know whether Jaws was in there, but it must have been adjacent. And she let me watch Jaws. And it was such a different experience to Jaws 2. The premise stays, but it wasn't the same film. It was vastly more interesting. It was vastly more moving. And it was one of those first films that sort of taught me that there's a big difference between great films and good films. And there's a humongous difference between great films and Jaws 2. And you start to, it's the age, I think, around about 12, 13, 14, where you start to discern what great films do. You start to figure things out, and then you work out that there's a director in charge of this, and he's making choices that make this distinct. I think, obviously I'm looking backwards, and I'm probably being a bit rose tinted in how clever I was, but that was definitely going on. And then Jaws became a habit, from there on. You just watched it every time it was on television. You watch it, I think I saw it on the big screen probably as a student, I think about 17, 18. But it became just one of those films that was part of my vocabulary as a fan.
So you say you saw it on VHS first. You've seen it in an interesting order. You say you don't have an interesting Jaws story, but I think you do actually, because you saw what most people consider sort of an inferior version.
Yeah.
But you saw the same scene. Then you watched Jaws all on the small screen and then on the big screen. And I tend to find people's experiences are very different with films if they've watched it in order, which is big screen, VHS, then the television cut. So what's that perspective like to see it on the first screen and then see it played out as it was meant to be on the big screen?
Well,
How did that affect your love of the movie?
The kind of what makes this probably not as clear an argument is that when I came to watch on the big screen, I obviously had watched it a few times on the small screen, but also by then I was thinking about film, and I was thinking about film's reputation and how to analyze film. So I think I came at the big screen experience a bit more involved in thinking about it and a bit more involved in, right, what is Jaws like on a big screen, rather than just letting it happen in front of me and just experiencing it. I had a bit more of a knowing kind of frame of mind. And that's like, now I'm watching Jaws on the big screen. But certainly, without a doubt, you get something very different from the big screen experience. And I think, though I can never truly experience it this way, Jaws was very built on those principles, in that it's a film full of crowds, certainly the first half of Jaws. And you're meant to watch it in a crowd. You're meant to catch the electricity of what's going on screen, the fear running through those crowds. That's meant to spread into the audience. There's a very sort of knowing relationship between Spielberg's imagery and the process of watching films. And that's a constant in his career. So absolutely, Jaws on the big screen is its own experience. I just don't, I would love to have had it, in America in 1975, when, you didn't know, and you didn't know who Spielberg was, and you didn't have these expectations. But by the time I did see it on the big screen, I was filled with expectation and, full of my own cleverness and all those kind of things. So I don't think I've ever seen it quite as clearly as that.
I know what you mean. I was kind of the same way about films like Blade Runner, for example,
Yeah.
which I didn't see on the big screen until much, much later. And then I found that the film had more of a profound impact, certainly visually, and the scene at the end with the Tears in Rain soliloquy. So I think if you see it in a different order in terms of format, and the years of expectations, it can sort of give you an interesting perspective, certainly. So in talking about the film, in the emails that come through, you've described Jaws as the perfect film. We've talked about Aliens actually being the perfect sequel.
So hoist by my own petard, I do.
No, that's fair. And I'm not trying to catch you out. But I mean, if you actually mention that to other people, they say, well, it's not perfect. Look at the shark effects, look at the blood and but we're not talking about the technicalities of the film, but we're talking about what the film means in terms of its impact. So in that regard, what makes it a perfect film?
Well, as you say, the idea of perfection is slightly absurd as a concept. There is no perfect film, because by what scale do you judge it? How do you judge it perfect? I say perfect in the sense that it's a perfect experience of movies. We're trying to bottle the movie experience as something thrilling and dynamic and really important as an art form. I think you can find that in Jaws in really richness, and it's a lot of it's to do with how Spielberg and obviously the story of the film's making is well known, and the fact that it was a disastrous shoot and that Spielberg had to sort of find his film through that catastrophe. I think it's a film that works beautifully because it's a filmmaker relying on instinct. And it's funny, it's a film about instincts, about a shark's instincts, about a studio's instinct, and it's about a director's instincts, because he had little else to go on. So he surrounds himself with people who work on their own instinct. So he begins to concentrate on character. He begins to concentrate on the audience's imagination becomes an important tool for him. And I think this is a very fine cinematic art, the great power of ambiguity. Because he couldn't show us the shark as much as he wanted to, he creates an aura where we create the shark ourselves through the music and the imagery and the symbolism of barrels and all the various techniques he uses to fill that gap. And that's so powerful, that idea, because whatever Spielberg would have come up with if his shark had worked, it was never going to be as good as the things the audience dreamt up in their minds, the dots they joined in their heads. And that creates a kind of fantastic relationship between you as a viewer and the material on screen, that you're making half the film for Spielberg. He's doing a very good job with the rest of it, but you're kind of creating it. Plus then, I think it's a much better film than the book. The book's good, but it's a much better film because he starts to let the themes resonate. This idea of fear and its different forms. Everybody in some senses is fearful in that film. Obviously Brody is frightened of the water, but he's also frightened of losing control. The mayor is fearful. He's fearful of losing the town. He's losing the votes, losing the community. He's a man reacting out of fear. He's not reacting very well, but he's reacting out of fear. Quint is almost a man fueled by the fear of the past, that his preordained death is waiting for him in the water. He was meant to get it back with the Indianapolis, and now it's coming for him. And there's the bigger elements of, man versus nature. Man has it coming. We have desecrated the planet, and now nature is coming back for us. And they're all sewn into the fabric of Jaws. It's not specifically about these things, it's about lots of these things. And something about having this space in the kind of dynamic of the film, in the drama of the film, allowed those things to really grow and become important. And I think that makes it a fabulous piece of cinema. Plus, visually and orally and in terms of performance, all those things are at peak fitness in Jaws. It's a 70s movie, yet it's very universal and accessible. So it has those two qualities in it simultaneously. It's a horror movie, but it's about America and it's about other things. It's a film that won't stay in a box, and that's to its endless credit. But if there was a box for it, I would just say a masterful piece of cinema.
Absolutely, because it's so many genres in one, really, isn't it? It's a monster movie, it's a horror movie, it's a thriller, it's a little bit comedic in places.
Yeah, very
Some of
much so.
the interplay between the characters is quite amusing,
Yeah.
especially Brody and his wife and Brody and
Oh,
Hooper.
and Brody and Hooper and Quinn, is a
Yes,
comedy
and
double
Hooper
act,
and Quinn is
Yeah.
great. Yeah. But there's a look, but what's good about it is that there's so much going on than just a shark in the water eating people. There's all the politics involved,
Yeah.
there's all the drama. And even as a 5, 6 year old watching this, okay, I didn't understand the nuances of, say, Quid's speech, but I remember being hooked. I was
Yeah.
listening,
Yeah.
hanging on every word. What does this mean? And there was not one bit of the film that was boring. Because you know what kids are like? They like to fast forward to the really good bits. There
Yeah.
was not one bit in the film that was boring. I think, do you think that's one of the reasons why it was not only generally successful, but actually created this new thing that well, it's not new to us,
Yeah.
but this new thing that became the summer blockbuster, that it
Yeah.
appealed on so many levels?
Yeah. But see, it's really interesting, isn't it? Because obviously that is the legacy, is that after Jaws, being released on 400 screens as it was a lot of screens at the time, it invented this idea of the big summer tentpole movie, the blockbuster as we know it. But if you watch it with that in mind, it doesn't really adhere to that concept. It's not really a blockbuster at all in terms of its nature. Um, and it's fascinating. You say it was never boring, and that's absolutely true. But if you think about it, it really dares being boring. It's only to a younger viewer. There's actually very little action in it. In the kind of normal sense, quite a lot at the end maybe, and there's sort of odd scenes. But in the kind of sense of what we in modern terms you think of as an action movie, there is very little in Jaws. It's very talky. It's very character driven. It only has sort of precisely measured jump scares. They're kind of orchestrated and put at very careful positions within the film to remind us how terrifying it is. But it hangs around with these notions of, the town and the politics of the town and, America at leisure and this rather sort of sense of decadence and a real sort of, Spielberg is very, very good at this, a sort of authentic backdrop for his fantasy. Whenever Spielberg sort of goes wrong, if he ever goes wrong, I tend to find it's when he steps out of reality and sort of tries to world build. Films like Hook and Ready Player One, to a certain extent, didn't work as well for me because he doesn't, what he does is he inserts fantasy into the reality of America, and that works incredibly well, and probably never better than in Jaws. So absolutely, and it is incredibly compelling, which makes it a blockbuster. Yet, what is it that is compelling is very hard to kind of pin down. It's kind of the nature of these people, their interaction. It is the elusive idea of hunting the shark. Where is the shark at any point? When will it turn up? And there's such a sort of fabulous idea of seeing that, the fear of it reflected in the faces of the characters. So much of Jaws goes on, well, in Brody's face. That's the map of the film in the sense of the kind of incredulity, the terror, a man who's lost control of the situation, a man who can't save what he has to save. And all those things sort of add up to something incredibly compelling and incredibly universal. There's a beautiful simplicity to Jaws in that we get it. We don't have to sort of figure it out. You know why things are happening as they are. You know who these people are. You understand it fully. Even at 5, 6 years old, you know what it's all about. The nuances may come later, but there is some incredibly keen sense of communication from the director's point of view to the audience, that he's never stopping to explain stuff to us. And that's all filmmaking. You know, that's what makes directors great, is that they're not laboring their film. You know, they're trusting their viewer, and we go with it.
Absolutely. And taking that into account, it is, even though it's a big studio film, Universal obviously were the studio behind it, it's still at its heart an independent film, because it is about the writer and the director's dream of how it should be, and also taking into account what to give to audiences. Now, bearing that in mind, the other impact of Jaws, obviously, is not what it created, this wonderful thing of the blockbuster, but what it spawned as well. It's not, and I'm not talking about the sequels, although, you know, maybe that's a conversation for another time. But this whole subgenre within horror or thriller, that is the shark mover, and everything that followed. Everybody
Bears,
had to make a shot.
piranhas, alligators, you know, any animal that was vaguely a predator could be thrown into a film. Yeah, I suppose it speaks to the primal nature of the story, that, you know, when you sort of pitch it as something mythical and classical, as man versus beast, you know, it does catch on to something that goes all the way back to sort of Greek drama and Beowulf, and, you know, there's a kind of an archetype that it knowingly adheres to, you know, in its own modern way. You know, the men are going off on a hunt at the end on the Orca, and they are classical. Quint, who, when you boil it down, is quite an absurd character. You know, he's Captain Ahab. You know, he's something drawn out of literature rather than reality. And again, that's very deliberate. But all those things sort of work toward manifesting a classical format. You know, taking, you know, everything from the Universal horror movies to 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea and all the great literature involving man versus beast, and then synthesizing that into an incredibly popular, brilliant film. And it's the nature of Hollywood then to try and use that as a mold to then manufacture numerous other ones. And it can be brilliant. I mean, Ridley Scott knowingly said Alien was Jaws in space. And I think he meant that as much about the tone and the character and the way you went about it, as much as he was copying the plot. It wasn't quite that, but he was copying the sensibility and applying it to a different idiom. And that, in fact, the two films tonally are quite similar, although their settings are very, very different. And of course, we've had endless kind of Roger Corman type things like Piranha and Piranha 2, and, you know, obviously it hit upon something. If you take away Spielberg's, you know, incredible talent and gifts, the very idea of making Jaws hit upon something, its concept spoke to people. You know, this idea of a shark in the water where we might go, you know, I think that was very important, that it was very relatable to an audience, because we all go in the sea, we all go on beaches, and we all probably have a slightly instinctual fear of what might be in the water. And once you play upon those kind of fears, you're going to have the biggest audience possible, because everyone can kind of get it or can relate to it. And I think studios just sort of, and filmmakers just thought, well, absolutely, we must play to that fear, which lies at the heart of the horror genre, you know, the fear of the unknown and trying to conceive of where man's vulnerability lies, survival, all the things that's sort of written into our genes that fire up the horror genre were crystallized in Jaws. So once you have something that good to follow, you're going to follow it en masse. You know, it's going to happen, and for good and bad. You know,
yeah. So you mentioned that when you get something that good, you follow it en masse, and that's what happened at the end of the day. And
totally.
And in amongst the flurry of films that came out, you do get some gems. You mentioned Roger Corman's. Well, it was Joe Dante who directed it.
Roger Corman made the Piranha.
John Sayles wrote it, but Roger Corman, you know, put the money behind. That was Piranha, of course. That was an absolute gem. Orca, Killer Whale, was an interesting, memorable film that came out as an So
I
you do,
remember I saw it on telly, Orca, and
yes.
I remember coming quite captivated by it. But going back to it, I was kind of much more aware of this is such a rip-off of Jaws, right down to Richard Harris playing basically Quint all over again. And yeah, but there were elements of it that were quite haunting. So bits of it worked.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
But there was a lot of fun to be had with the genre, I think, when the films came out, and there were some real gems that you mentioned, Piranha. I think for me, Deep Blue Sea is a bit of fun, and
Yeah,
I think also it
DVC,
taps into the Jurassic Park themes of
yeah,
just because you can doesn't mean to say you should.
yeah, you kind of throw two things into the mix and see what comes out of it. And
Yeah.
I like the fact that Deep Blue Sea is very playful. And if you're going to, hearken to another film so strongly or another film so strongly, you're going to play the game they played. I think you must admit to it, and people like you more for it. And I think Deep Blue Sea says we know what we're doing, and we know you understand what we're up to, and then have fun with that. And that whole idea of sort of putting sharks in confined spaces, and it sort of became a bit alieny as well. It sort of threw everything into the mix there, but it's an enjoyable film.
Oh, absolutely. So let's come back to your documentary.
Yeah,
Now, you've said you're taking a very different approach with this. It's less about the stories and behind the scenes. And I think, as you've remarked, we know so much about the
yes,
production values, and the controversies, and the difficulties, and what have you. And you're going for more of a, if I understand correctly, a personal insight from the people
yeah.
you speak to. Who have you got lined up, without giving too much away?
Well,
What
it's
kind of
it's
people have you
still
got lined up to talk about
to
the
speak
film?
very honestly, it's still very early. We are
Mhm.
only just going into production, sort of as we speak. So we've got a couple of names sort of in place, but I won't give them away yet because I'm a little bit superstitious. Um, the aim is to, if you think about the expanded, there's a kind of obviously we have all the people involved in the film who we speak to. Then there's sort of another tier of people who are what you might want to call exalted fans, sort of celebrity fans, other filmmakers, creatives, really strong kind of people who've written books on the subject, experts. They're the people I want to tap into. They're the people who are going to tell me the Jaws story from their point of view. And this is really an important part of Explored. And it does echo what we do in Expanded, is this idea of everybody sees the film their own way, and listening to them tell the stories will be the great pleasure of Jaws Explored, that they're going to interpret it their way. I'll throw similar questions at them all. But, something like, the mayor, where do you stand on Murray Hamilton's mayor and his part in the plot? And I want 20 different answers. People going, well, actually, he's this, and then you look at this, and is he Nixon, and all the different readings you can do. Ludicrous, brilliant. In the sense, it's not my take on Jaws that's going to be Jaws Explored. I will manage the information and cut the film and go with what my instinct tells me. But it's all the participants' take on Jaws. It's the collective kind of interviewees and their take on a film that I know they will love. The one great point of confidence in going in is that we don't have to explain why Jaws is great. We will accept that from the moment the documentary begins, that everybody loves this film. It's then about why. And we will, to some extent, go through the film chronologically, not probably quite as literal as the expanded, which are chapter after chapter after chapter. I think we're going to go in and we're going to pull back out to be a bit more thematic, look at overviews. We talked about fear. I think there's going to be a whole section on the nature of fear in Jaws. But just let the voices through that then talk us through the film and talk us through their experience of the film. And what I've learned from the two previous documentaries is that what people love watching it often is the performance of the interviewee. It's just how they tell you what they tell you. And, the humor and anecdotes and detail. And, this makes my life easy. Once you get great talkers, you just sort of sit back and think, well, I'm going to have that, I'm going to have that, and just slot them together in the right way. And you've got your story, but it should be a shared experience. If a great director talks about their first time they saw it and what they got out of it, that hopefully will echo what everyone else gets out of it. There'll be a relatability to what people on screen are saying. It should never be educational, and it shouldn't be, kind of highfalutin. What it is a conversation. It's a great conversation, really in-depth conversation between us all, people watching the film and those in the film, and me sort of mediating that in the middle.
So bringing in all these different views, perspectives, personal stories that people will probably share. Like you've said, you're bringing in a wide range, potentially a wide range of people who will come at it from very different angles. What do you, and I know you don't have everybody lined up yet, but taking this format, what do you anticipate or hope that viewers of the documentary who are already familiar with what to expect from yourself and other CREATORVC projects, what do you hope will be the takeaway?
Obviously, fundamentally, you hope it'll be very entertaining. You simply want people to enjoy it.
Of course.
And to sort of sit down, and however long it'll be, and I don't know yet, they'll just like watching it, and it'll be not boring. That's your first rule: don't make it boring. And your other first rule is don't make it confusing. So get boring and confusing out of the way, and hopefully you've got a very entertaining film. What, maybe my grander hope is that I will enhance your appreciation of Jaws, that coming out of watching Jaws, that you will, watch it in a new way, watch it differently, be able to appreciate it differently. Maybe it will give you a way of looking at it. Even if you disagree with some of the points made in the documentary, you can look at those points and have your own views, your view on the mayor, rather than everyone else's. It will ask you questions about your favorite film, and you will enjoy answering them. I always say this, that it's never the point of any of these documentaries to conclude the argument, to put a full stop on it and go, that is it, we've solved the thing, we've solved Alien, now we're going to solve Jaws. The last word has been had. That would be a terrible thing, I think, to conclude. All I'm doing is sort of having a brilliant conversation about it that fuels many more conversations, including your personal conversation with the film itself, your relationship with Jaws and Spielberg. That, it's all part of it. So I'm just opening it up rather than in any way closing it off. So that's what I hope. You'll see the film in new eyes and hear it with new ears, but come to love it more. You hope that it enhances is the important thing. That we're here because we love these films, and we're trying to express our love of these films, and we're trying to find a language to do that in a modern world where everything's very fragmented and a culture is all over the place, all over the map. And I think these films are very important to people as sort of life rafts in that. The problem with talking about Jaws is everything becomes a kind of corny metaphor of Jaws. All your language, it's a life raft. It's going in a deep dive. Everything seems to be a joke about Jaws.
Yes.
But yeah, you hope, that, what we're doing is reinforcing the endurance of these films. It's 51 years old, Jaws.
Yes.
But it's never felt more fresh and important. And that's true of The Thing and Aliens as well. I think what I really came to realize is that these films are in the present for people. They're not old things. I mean, they obviously are made a time ago, but they have, you watch them in a sense of they're an ongoing thing for you. They don't go away. Like albums from your favorite musicians and bands, you don't think of them as old. You just think of them as things you have and need to listen to. And I think that's what we're trying to maintain and be part of, that, it's your life. And if these things are really important to you, then we agree.
So do you think, taking that into account, then, do you think that what makes Jaws so personable for people is the fact that it's not just a film that's lasted the test of time and will continue to do so, or that it had the cultural, the impact on the industry, but that actually it's been I suppose, like the works of Shakespeare. I didn't mean to compare Jaws to Shakespeare, but like the works of Shakespeare, there's so much imagery and words and sentences that are ingrained in our culture. I mean, how many times do people paraphrase, "We're going to need a bigger boat"? To me, to mean something, and then change the words but to essentially mean the same thing, that we're essentially out of our depth here and we're going to need to
Yeah.
reconsider what we're doing.
Yeah, we've misjudged the problem here.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. When you take on something as big as Jaws, and without wanting to, disparage my previous films, I think Jaws is a bigger film than Aliens and The Thing, just in terms of its universal kind of popularity. It's one of the kind of hallmarks of cinema. You run the risk of getting a bit overwhelmed by that, not having a big enough boat to tackle it. If you want to go with the cliche, you run that risk of it's too big. And what I'm trying to do, I think, is return to it as a film and return to Steven Spielberg as the guy on the set calling the shots and saying, this is what I want, and editing and designing a film, not Spielberg, the great god of cinema who changed all our childhoods. That will inevitably feed into it, and that will come up. But it's reminding people that he made a film, and this was the film he made, and how he made it, is really important in terms of choices and the film that we watch. So it's sort of reclaiming it, and reclaiming its place as a piece of movie making rather than, the grand legacy. And, I think I want to get past that quite quickly. We might open with a sort of sense of that. And then you just want to go, right, bang, what's going on in the film? That's what we're talking about here. It's us in the movie. All of that other stuff is sort of happening elsewhere. And you want to do that. And maybe when you come out of it at the other end of that journey, you'll remind people of what it did for Spielberg's career and how it echoed outwards, obviously, again, because that's a mark of its quality. But, for want of a better sentence, I'm trying to make Jaws small again. And that sounds absurd, I know. But I'm trying to kind of get it back into the VHS tape that I had in my hands. I want to get it back into that experience. And it's a very personal one. And, I don't want to get caught up too much in that Jaws created the blockbuster. Jaws did this. Jaws killed the 70s. I'm sure all the interviewees will talk about those things, and they are valid things. But I sort of want to get into it and go, but it's a film, isn't it? And why is that great? And why does it work as a film?
In terms of being a part of that, then when people sort of come to Jaws Explored, it is jawsexplored.com, isn't it?
Yeah, jawsexplored.com.
Jawsexplored.com.
Yeah.
What sort of things can people expect to sign up to then when they look down the choice? What sort of perks and rewards would they get by supporting the film?
Well, obviously, it's anyone who knows CREATORVC and CREATORVC's work know that the model and the kind of marketing world and the creation of libraries of great documentaries is the purpose. So if you've backed a previous one, such as In Search of Darkness or Aliens Expanded or The Thing Expanded, it's not simply that you get a finished film. You get hopefully a sense of participation. You get a sense of going on a journey with the film. And, when you sign up at the beginning and we haven't even shot any footage, I think there's an understanding from the backer to us that we're going to go ahead and make this thing together. We're going to go, and you are helping us make this thing. Otherwise it wouldn't exist. And we try and enhance that. We're going to have series of sort of vidcasts and podcasts, pretty much more attuned to ideas in the film. And we're going to have an opportunity, as we did with the Two Expandeds, for people to have a look at the assembly, which is a very rough version of the film. And if you choose to, you don't have to. It's not like required homework. But also it gives you a chance to say what you think. And when we've done that before, as nerve-wracking it is for me, you learn a lot. And people give you actually very wise points. We said, like that, too much of that. It's a rough version, so inevitably it's going to have a few bumps in it. So that's really important. The package itself is classic CREATORVC, slightly enhanced. So there will be the kind of posters and T-shirts, but there will be actually a book that will come with the DVD. It was sort of part of the DVD package. because I think we want to make the explored format particularly a little bit sort of Taschen-like, a little bit Criterion-like. I don't want to sound overly, grandiose, but I think that's our, we want to launch a whole series with Explored. Jaws is just the first one. I know other film titles have been sort of brought up. I personally want to do Blade Runner. I've got
You've mentioned that before.
busy dance card at the moment, but hopefully I will do Blade Runner down the line, and it will kind of fit a format that we're creating with Jaws with a degree of flexibility. And there's kind of various levels of package you can do, up to executive producer and producer. But above all, it's sort of about being part of it. We're going to kind of, obviously, as the journey goes on, we will figure out ways of keeping you updated, newsletters, production videos, all sorts of things that you can learn how it's going. I think one thing is important to emphasize with Jaws Explored, it will take a year. In previous documentaries, it's taken 2 years. A lot of that is down to needing certain people from the films and waiting for them because they have busy schedules. Kurt Russells and James Camerons of this world have very busy schedules, and you're just trying to find your window, and that can mean delays in the production for good reasons. That won't be the case with Jaws Explored because there's no one. There's gonna be a lot of people we really want, but no one is necessary for the finished film in that same way because
I get what you mean.
So it'll be a more immediate sense of, right, you invest now, you will get your film in a year's time. So that's the kind of the package. And it's because it's a slightly different format, there's a slightly different pricing, but hopefully, as I was saying, hopefully what you're also buying into is a series of films. You can now think, well, with Jaws going, I know other directors have got their favorite films they're kind of hovering around wanting to do in a similar way, which is just fantastic. I think ultimately, from a creative VC point of view, there'll be a shelf of yours with 4 or 5 expanded, numerous In Search of Darknesses, and then 10 Exploreds, and to be referred to and watched whenever you wish. So that's the goal.
So like a library of curated works, really.
Absolutely. Very genre-led, films within that bandwidth, but we will look at how wide that bandwidth can go. Once Jaws is an interesting case because it's pushing us a little bit, I would say mainstream, that's not the right word, but towards something a bit less focused on this genre, because The Thing was a sort of horror sci-fi, Aliens was a sci-fi movie, it was horror as well. But Jaws kind of stretches a bit wider than that. And I think we might, if it goes well, could we do thrillers? I'd love to do Silence of the Lambs, but we don't yet know how popular that might be from our backers' point of view. So there's a bit of an experiment here in terms of the choice of film. But the mainstay of what we do will be horror and sci-fi. Absolutely.
Okay. Well, I certainly look forward to seeing this when it's completed. And I've got to say, when I asked you about the benefits and perks that come with supporting the film, I do think, yes, it's important as part of the promotion to talk about the tangible benefits. But I really like the fact you talked about this is making you part of the journey. And this is something I try to explain to people about the nature of fan-funded filming or crowdfunding, which is like you said, people know what to expect largely from a creative VC project, especially if they've been following you. But you're still parting with money and putting faith, not to put any pressure on you, but you're showing, you're putting faith in the fact that you're paying for something that hasn't been made yet, but you have faith that what you're going to get at the end is probably about what you expect, if not better than what you could ever expect.
And it's a big responsibility from my side. I mean, you are essentially my bosses, all the backers, and I'm answering to you, and if it's not, a documentary that people like, that will affect other documentaries and affect other choices. So that there is a pressure. Not that I'm comparing myself to Steven Spielberg at all, but he's a man, every time he picks up a camera, has to be Steven Spielberg. He has to meet an expectation that exists based on all the fabulous films he's made. And I kind of getting a sense, that we have to meet that expectation, and it's a good thing. You shouldn't be overconfident. You must go into these things with an element of fear, because you got to live up to yourself. And as I said right at the beginning, I always want the next thing to be the best thing I've done. It just goes without saying. And so I want Jaws Explored to be the best thing I've done, and that's a pressure, but in its own way, in its own form and its own format, and which will be different from Expanded.
Okay. So last question then, because I think now's a good time to ask you this. So I think I've mentioned before, and I've mentioned in intro, that people will probably know you best from your books and from your work in Empire. We've discussed that previously. But you're making the transition in a way from author and journalist to storyteller and filmmaker, or documentarian, curator. How are you finding that transition? And is it everything you hoped it would be, or what? How has that sort of impacted your journey in exploring these films?
Everything's changed and nothing's changed. It's true to say. It is a different format, but the principles of what I do haven't changed from Empire to books, and the books are carrying on. I'm not, I've got 2 or 3 books, sort of on back burners and various sort of places, coming to fruition. So I remain a writer at heart, fundamentally. That's kind of what I am. But I've really loved the documentary format in terms of expressing similar things, but in a maybe a more dynamic visual way. And I've learned so much, and now I am very excited to be able to sort of come at it a little bit more proactively. And it's a reactive process, documentary making. So you draw the story from the interviews. You can't create the interviews, you can't script them. But I want to maybe with Jaws push my own kind of sense of, can I create sort of parts of the documentary sections and then insert the interviews into them? Can I visualize things slightly differently to Expanded? Can I sort of push how we do it in the edit and with the graphics and with the shoots, that it feels slightly different tonally, and it's got a different format? And so I suppose that's me getting more ambitious as a filmmaker and a storyteller. There'll be an endless battle inside my head between, as a writer on the page, you want to be as detailed as possible, and it's kind of, you want to. Whereas with documentaries, while it's very detailed and we're very long on documentaries, it's less like that, and you have to kind of know about feel, and you have to know about just leaving things hanging in the air, and you have to like Spielberg learned with Jaws, you have to let the audience have a brain. You have to let them go with things rather than you explain it to them and underline it. And I find that very satisfying once I've made my peace with it, and I've got a very good editor, Sam, who knows, he's like, we should cut out here, stop here. And it's a better point than if you let 3 other people say the same thing. There's your out. And you sort of learn, it's like music, you learn that that's the end, not keep going. And I really enjoy that part of it. And hopefully I'll do, enhance that with Jaws Explored.
Well, that's it for this episode of Cine Bijou. Thanks for joining us as we pulled open the curtain once more, revealing the world of independent film and the creative mavericks who make it all happen. You can find this and every other episode on Spotify, YouTube, and of course, Apple Podcasts. And if you enjoyed this episode, why not leave a star review or drop us a comment? It's a small gesture, sure, but it means the world to us, and it helps fellow film fans find their way to us too. Make sure you also follow us on all the usual social media haunts: Instagram, Facebook, Threads and Blue Sky. And for reviews, features and more, why not pay us a visit at our website www.cine-bijou.co.uk. And if you are spreading the word, please don't forget to use the hashtag #SupportIndieFilm, because every share helps keep great stories in the spotlight.